I still couldn't believe that Robbie had left me without even saying a word. I was so angry and devastated that he left without a single word to me after 24 years of marriage. How could he do that to me? Still, everyone was telling me that I had to put him aside and get on with my life. I know that they're right, but it is still so very hard for me to do. In an effort to try to move on, I had decided to reorganize the basement. It had been Robbie's sanctuary when he just wanted to be by himself and play his guitar. I thought all his stuff was gone, but then I found this one box in a corner next to a bookshelf. Aside from some high school stuff, there were about a dozen notebooks. Apparently, he kept a series of journals over the years. Then I noticed a 3-ring binder where Robbie seemed to have put all the disjointed bits of the various journals into one place. The sight of Robbie's journal brought another burst of sadness, anger, and more tears for him abandoning me. Finally, when I got control of myself, I wiped the tears off my cheeks and took the binder upstairs to the living room. After settling myself on the couch, with my heart still totally broken, I started to read Robbie Wilder's journal. I learned to play the guitar when I was 4 years old. My granddaddy, Seth Wilder, taught me and bought me my first guitar when I was 6. From that time on, it seemed like I had a guitar in my hands just about all the time. My granddaddy also taught me to love country music. In fact, he taught me to appreciate every other form of music. Well, that's not exactly true. He was hard put to teach any appreciation for rap. And I have to admit that I still haven't found a rap song that stirs my soul. To me, it just seems kind of rough and crude. But I guess that's why they say, different strokes for different folks. On the other hand, there is something about country music that really strikes a chord with me. Now, I'm not saying that I like all country music, but I find way more that I like than I don't. I especially like many of the stars from the 50s through the 70s. Singers like George Jones, Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson, Loretta Lynn, Kenny Rogers, and especially Patsy Cline. I love just about everything those artists did. When I turned 12, my parents, Jason and Hannah, let my granddaddy take me on weekend tours of churches within a 50-mile radius. Granddad was part of a trio that played and sang gospel songs to a dozen or more churches once a month on a rotating basis. The group would perform at 2 or 3 churches over a weekend. They were popular, and the attendance at those churches always picked up when they knew Granddad and his group would be there. I remember my dad's last words to me before we hit the road that first time. He knew how nervous I was. "Robbie, just let the music flow from your soul, and you'll do fine." And every day since then, whenever I play and sing, I've tried to let people feel how much the music means to me. I can play guitar with the best of them, but I believe my voice is only mediocre. My granddaddy never agreed with my assessment, but then he always thought everything I did was great. Still, I can project power into my songs that most singers can't. And over the years, I've developed an ability to instantly connect with an audience. Still, on this first trip, I was beyond nervous when we reached the first church. I say church, but in reality, it was just an oversized chapel. It could seat maybe 40 people. However, I could see perhaps another 200 folding chairs set up under the trees around the front and side of the church. I also noticed the speakers hung from the 2 sides of the church and from a couple of trees. My stomach felt like jello as I followed my granddad up to the altar. My granddaddy played acoustic guitar with Bert Zimmer playing bass guitar and Willie Stanton playing the banjo or the fiddle. I usually played acoustic guitar, but I could also play the bass guitar or the banjo. I wasn't quite as good as Bert or Willie, but I was damn close. And within 2 years, I would surpass them. The church was really pretty with pews that had hand carvings on each end. Also, there were stained glass windows all around with their vibrant colors. The altar was made from mahogany with an elaborate cross carved into the center with angels at each corner. The huge crucifix that hung behind the altar had been hand-carved. The expression that had been carved into Christ's face made you almost feel his pain. The pastor began the service, but I noticed that it was an abbreviated one. We did 2 hymns to augment his service with me manning the banjo. After we got into the first song, I kind of relaxed. All I had to do was to play my instrument. However, after the church service was completed, we began the real performance. And I knew that I had to sing a duet with my granddad, just a closer walk with thee. As we got closer to that number, I started to get really nervous again. But my granddaddy was so smooth with the church members that I believed they would have clapped if I screeched like a chicken hawk. Anyway, the numbers leading up to my duet went well, and the church members were quite appreciative. When I got up to sing the duet, I was still very nervous, but a smile from my granddaddy calmed me right down. When we finished, the congregation cheered us. That was the first time, outside of my family, that anyone had applauded my music. It was a thrill like I had never felt before. I was hooked. The pastor was extremely pleased. He said that this was the largest attendance his church had ever had. The donations made that day would help pull them out of the red. The only money my granddaddy's group would ever take was a few dollars for gas and food if the church women hadn't prepared something. Before we left, the pastor wanted to get a date when my granddad and his group would be back. It was decided that we'd return in 2 months. My granddad liked to give every church that wanted his group an equal chance. The next church was an hour away, and it was one of those mega churches. You know, the ones that have thousands of members. They actually had their own band that performed most Sundays, but today, the band members were just going to be spectators. The church seemed more like an auditorium set up for a rock concert. The entire hall was set up to maximize the acoustics. Even the crucifix, made of metal, was angled to minimize any interference to the sounds coming from the altar. The windows, while stained glass, looked more like modern art. As nervous as I had been at the first performance, I was terrified at this one. There would be several thousand in attendance, including the standing room only people. The other church had been small and intimate, while this church was just so huge and intimidating. The sound system was amazing. It would put many recording studios to shame. What made this performance even more intimidating was that I had to do a solo of Amazing Grace. I was sure I was going to mess up big time. This worry had set my stomach to churning. And it didn't help that when we stopped for lunch, I had crammed down a double cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate shake. It wasn't sitting well on my stomach now. I was having terrible gas pains, but I didn't know what to do. Still, I knew, regardless, I had to go on. With grit and determination, I clamped down hard on my butt cheeks and tried to soldier through. I was given a small stool to sit on, with a mic set right before me. The group had just begun its first song when I couldn't hold the gas in any longer. I let out this ear-splitting fart, and because of where the mic was positioned, it amplified my gastric blast. The group stopped playing and looked over at me. A hush fell over the church while my face turned 16 different shades of red. I did the only thing I could think to do. I leaned close to the microphone and said, "The devil made me do it." A roar erupted from the congregation, and I could see my granddaddy and his buddies cracking up. When things began to settle down, my granddad looked over at me and said, "Don't you have something else you should say?" With a grin, I leaned into the mic again. "With God's grace and forgiveness, I won't do it again." Another roar erupted from the congregation. My granddad just chuckled and began to play again. I was never nervous in front of a crowd after that. Before I knew it, it was time for my solo. Even with what I thought was an average voice, I intended to power into this song. So, I put every ounce of energy I could into my rendition of Amazing Grace. As the last notes were fading away, the congregation was on its feet, cheering. The rest of the concert was a huge success. On the way home, there was considerable teasing about my gastric misadventure. But after dropping off Bert and Willie, my granddad turned serious. "Robbie, you had a great day today," he said with pride. "However, I hope you won't let it go to your head. I pray you never get the bug to become a famous singer. I've seen thousands of people chase that dream, and many of them are way better than you, but almost all of them wind up being bitterly disappointed. Millions of people every year chase that same dream, and only a handful ever realize success. Just love the music for its own beauty, and you won't ever be disappointed." Between my daddy and my granddaddy, the basis of my philosophy toward music and performing had taken root. I loved to play even if there was no one around, but I felt doubly blessed if there was someone to share my music with. I continued to perform with my granddad for 3 more years. However, the group then began to fall apart. First, Bert had a stroke and couldn't play anymore, and then Willie passed away from a sudden heart attack. Finally, it was just my granddad and me, but after a few more months, it ended. My granddad's heart wasn't in it anymore. Besides, I was in high school and had discovered girls. Actually, I had discovered girls much earlier than this, but I have never understood the workings of the female mind, and I don't think any guy ever will. Perhaps it was just my poor choices, but every time I tried to form a relationship with a girl or a woman, I'd get screwed in the end. When I was in the 3rd grade, I took a liking to Rebecca Simons. She was a tiny, blonde-headed girl that I thought was the prettiest thing ever. We became friendly, and then she said if I gave her my special rock, she would be my girlfriend. In reality, it was just a crystal that my mother had bought me. Still, when the sun shone through it at a certain angle, it would display a rainbow of colors. However, 3 days later, Rebecca gave my rock to Jimmy Wheeler to be her boyfriend. When I challenged Rebecca about my special rock, she just laughed at me. I never did get it back. In the 7th grade, Annie Adams convinced me that she would show me hers if I showed her mine. Being naturally curious, I readily agreed. Unfortunately, we got caught. All hell broke loose, especially when Annie claimed that it was all my idea. And back then, as it is today, they believed the girl. I got the thrashing of my life, but I took consolation in the fact that I had seen Annie's. Still, I didn't understand why Annie had turned on me. When I asked her about it, she just smirked. As the years progressed, I was suspicious of girls, so I only had a dozen or so dates well into my junior year. I wasn't a bad-looking guy, but I was no hunk. Then I met Sally Bertrand. She was only a sophomore but really cute. I had 3 dates with her before I asked her to the junior prom. She was thrilled, and so was I. I ordered a tux and bought the tickets. 2 days before the prom, Sally told me her parents were making her go with Craig Wilkes. I knew this was bullshit. Craig was the captain of the basketball team and a junior who should have been a senior. There was no doubt in my mind. She was trading up. I was crushed, but there was no way that I would let Sally know it. This was because of some advice my granddaddy had given me. Just before my grandfather decided to stop performing, he asked me if I had a girlfriend. When I told him no, he chuckled and said it was just as well. Then he explained that when I did decide to date girls, there was a good chance that one or more of them would break my heart. And if that happened, he told me to never let the woman know that it bothered me and never beg them to come back. And most importantly, he told me that if someone broke my heart, only time and distance or another woman would mend it. So, when Sally gave me the news, I told her it was no big deal. I just asked someone else. I knew from her expression, she was insulted by my reaction. That alone gave me a small measure of satisfaction. I promptly went and asked one of Sally's friends if they'd like to go to the prom with me. In fact, I asked her best friend, Carol Adamson, who wasn't as pretty as Sally but still cute. She was thrilled. Really, it was a no-brainer for her. A sophomore girl being asked to the prom by an upperclassman was an instant status boost. The prom turned out to be pretty much a bore. I danced a lot with Carol, but she was really annoying. Just about every sentence out of her mouth ended with, you know? However, the evening was not a total loss. Craig managed to get drunk on whiskey that someone smuggled into the dance. I learned later that he threw up all over Sally while they were making out. Karma can certainly be a bitch. I went to community college for a year, but it wasn't for me. Even though I was a music major, I didn't think my professors really understood music. They were big on theory, but they had no soul. So, I dropped out and got a job in a music store where I met and married Susie Carlucci. She was a hot-blooded Italian girl from a large family. She chased me until I fell hopelessly in love with her. Over the next 6 months we dated, and I was thrilled when she agreed to marry me. Even though her mother and father hated me, her brothers thought I was cool. They frequently came to the clubs where I performed. I loved working at the music store, but it certainly wasn't a high-paying job. Even combining my regular pay with what I made from teaching people to play different instruments, I only brought in about $30,000 a year. However, I averaged roughly $100 a week playing at various bars and cafes. Altogether, I was earning a little over $35,000 a year. That was more than a lot of people made in Tifton, Georgia. Susie and I were married for 3 years, and I thought everything was great. I loved her to death. I thought she loved me, and the sex was really good. But one day, I came home, and Susie was sitting in the living room of our rented house with a suitcase next to her. "What's going on?" I asked. "I'm sorry, Robbie, but I'm leaving you," she said as she looked at herself in a compact mirror. My granddad's advice immediately kicked in. Not that anyone gives a damn, but any particular reason? "Once we're divorced, I'm marrying George Minard," Susie said as she stared at me with disdain. "You have no ambition, and I want so much more than you can ever give me." "Are you talking about the fat pig who owns the car dealerships?" I said with a nasty smile. "You've been screwing that? I hear he has a tiny wiener." Susie laughed at me. "His is larger than yours." That laugh, followed by the smirk on her face, caused me to snap. Thankfully, I didn't go postal on my wife. However, I did grab Susie by the hair and jerk her to her feet. She started screaming as I grabbed the back of her jeans and lifted her up. I carried her to the front door, kicked it open, and threw her onto the front lawn. Then I threw her suitcase out beside her. Next, I called her parents and told them where they could pick up the trash. When Susie's father answered the phone, I snarled into it, "Albert, your bitch daughter has been screwing George Minard. I just threw her out onto the front lawn. Pick her up before the garbage men take her." Yeah, Minard got her pregnant. Of course, I made that part up. At the time, I didn't know anything about Susie being pregnant. I just threw that in because I knew the Carluccis were big Catholics, and something like that wouldn't sit well. As it turned out, Susie was, in fact, pregnant. Still, The Carlucci family took her back, but they never warmed up to George. It didn't matter. My heart was shattered, and worse, I could do nothing about it. Having people wrong you and have to sit there and take it is the worst feeling in the world. Oh, I got a little bit of revenge because my next call was to Mrs. Minard to tell her what her husband and my wife were up to. Apparently, Susie had jumped the gun a little. Good old George was trying to hide a bunch of money before serving his wife with divorce papers. Now forewarned, Mrs. Minard, Carol, descended on Mr. Minard with a horde of lawyers. She didn't take him to the cleaners, but she got her pound of flesh out of him. I learned about that from my lawyer in the course of my divorce. However, that little nugget of information didn't really soothe my feelings at all. I was devastated by Susie's betrayal, and my soul was crushed. Still, I didn't want anyone to know how much I was hurting, so I had to carry on. Okay, I admit that I did get drunk that night, but I went to my parents and sobered up the next day. I told them what Susie had done minus the pregnancy part, which I still didn't know about at that time. Instead, I made it sound like Susie and I had become more like roommates. I don't know if they believed me, but they were very supportive. Susie had stabbed me in the back, and calling Mrs. Minard and Susie's parents was the only revenge I would get. What made it pure torture for me was seeing Susie riding around in her new BMW convertible, sometimes with George and sometimes by herself. And Susie decided that she would have her payback for me throwing her on the front lawn. She would drag George to some of my performances and heckle me. I tried to ignore them at first, but finally, I'd had enough and went after them verbally one night. I suppose I crossed the line when I asked Susie if she knew who the father of her unborn child was. That did get them to leave, but Susie still won in the end because I got fired. The bar's owner also refused to pay me for the night. Every day it seemed to get worse. Still, I refused to let anyone know how much I was hurting. The Monday after I literally threw Susie out, I went back to work at the music store. Around noon, 3 of Susie's brothers showed up, and I figured I was going to get the beatdown of my life. When I saw them coming through the front door, I slipped some brass knuckles onto my right hand. They were probably going to kick the hell out of me, but I was going to mess up 1 or 2 of them. But they didn't do anything. "Robbie, can we talk to you?" Frankie, the oldest, asked when they walked in. I knew there was no place to run, so I nodded. "Look, we just want you to know that there are no hard feelings from us," Frankie said as he shuffled awkwardly in front of the cash register. "I mean, I wish you hadn't thrown her out onto the front lawn considering that she's pregnant, but we get it. You were justified." "Well, screw me with a crooked stick," I said in total surprise. Now, I felt bad about manhandling Susie. Even though it wasn't my kid, I would have felt horrible if anything happened to the baby. "I appreciate that," I said cautiously, "but I didn't know Susie was pregnant." "You told our dad she was pregnant," Sal, the youngest, challenged. "I know I accused her of it, but I really didn't know," I answered. "I was just messing with your dad's head." The 3 brothers began to chuckle. Then Frankie spoke. "I wish I had been there to see Susie land on her bum. That would have been priceless. Susie and Mom have been screaming at us to kick the shit out of you. Dad told them to shut their pie holes. He said you had every right to do what you did and more." "Really?" I was totally surprised that Susie's dad stood up for me. I thought he hated me. "Oh, he still hates you," Frankie confirmed. "It's just that he's an old-fashioned Italian man, and he can't stand cheating wives. Susie has already caught his wrath and his backhand 2 or 3 times for talking back." I was happy that Susie's brothers weren't angry with me. I truly liked them all, and I did try to get on with my life in Tifton. But then my granddad began to fade. He had been put into a nursing home a month or 2 before Susie and I split. His mind was beginning to falter, and that really saddened me. Of course, I went to visit him as often as possible, and I told him the whole story of Susie and me splitting up. On that particular day, he was more or less with it. "Robbie," he said with a sad smile, "you need time, and you need to put some distance between you and your ex-wife." We talked for about an hour before he got tired. Just before I left that night, he reminded me to never chase the dream of being famous. He died the next day. I struggled on for another 3 months, but with my granddaddy dead and the love of my life now living with another man, I knew it was time to move on. My parents didn't want me to go, but they understood why I had to. The idea of leaving Tifton was scary. I had never thought about moving anywhere else until Susie dumped me and my granddaddy died. However, the good thing about Tifton is that it is only about 3.5 hours up I-75 to Atlanta. Plus, I wound up with a little over $5,000 after the divorce. Most of it was money that I had been secretly putting away to take Susie on vacation to Europe. I guess I was supposed to split it with her by law, but I figured, screw her. I said goodbye to my folks, gave the finger to George Minard's dealership, and hit the road. When I got to Atlanta, it only took me a day to get settled. All I felt I could afford was a room in College Park. As it turned out, the room was in a house owned by a nice black family, the Monroes. Henry and Mabel Monroe had been happily married for almost 35 years. Both were in their mid-50s. Tyron and Tabor were their 2 sons. Both lived at home, and they paid rent also. Mabel and Henry were hesitant about renting to me because I was white. In fact, Henry even came out and said that he'd feel strange renting to a white man. "Oh Lord," I said as I frantically touched my face. "I'm white?" This cracked up Mabel, and she put her hand on Henry's arm. "He'll be fine. Rent him the room." It was a little strange at first, but they treated me well. And after the brutal betrayal by my wife, it was soothing to watch a loving family interact. Henry was a postman, and Mabel worked in a daycare center. Tyron was a mechanic, and Tabor said he sold real estate. After a while, I figured out Tabor was, in fact, a low-level drug dealer. His parents didn't know that he sold small amounts of marijuana, crystal meth, and ecstasy. Strange as it may seem, I got along with Tabor the best. No, I didn't use drugs. I preferred beer. What I liked about Tabor was his friendly humor. He was really funny and kept everyone laughing. Years later, I was devastated to hear that he had been gunned down one night in a drug deal gone bad. I choose College Park because MARTA, the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, runs right through it. I could walk to the station, and I wouldn't have to take my car into the city. Finding a parking spot is almost impossible, and it costs a fortune to park in a lot in downtown Atlanta. Once I was settled, I set about looking for a job. I must have applied at 40 or more different places. At first, I hit all the music stores within a reasonable distance. None of them were hiring. Then I started with the want ads. After an interview, either they weren't interested in me, or I wasn't interested in them. After 2 weeks of not finding a job, I was beginning to get discouraged. One afternoon, after getting turned down for another job, I decided to stop at a bar just down the street from my last interview. Anyway, it was Friday, and I didn't have any more interviews for the day. So, I thought I'd get a drink and something to eat. The outside of this bar was very deceiving. It was much larger inside than it appeared from the street. I expected to step into a relatively small room with a bar counter and a few chairs and tables spread around. However, once I was through the double doors, the room expanded out on both sides. Because the lighting was kind of dim, I couldn't see it all. A long bar ran along the right side, with about a dozen patrons having an early afternoon bracer. The main floor was crowded with maybe 80 or 90 tables. What caught my eye right away was a small stage at the far end of the room. From the doorway, I could see instruments resting against several stools in the center of the stage. It looked like they had live entertainment, and that piqued my interest. But first, I wanted to get something to eat and a beer. I slid into a seat 3 down from the closest customer and waited for someone to notice me. From a used coaster on the bar, I learned that the place's name was Big Carl's, and apparently, they did have live entertainment. Even though there weren't that many patrons, 3 people were working behind the bar. 2 were young men, and the other was a very attractive young woman. One of the guys appeared to be about 6 feet tall with brown hair. He had a very effeminate way about him. Still, he smiled a lot and seemed pleasant enough. The other seemed to be a couple of inches shorter with jet black hair and talked a blue streak to his partner. The girl was even prettier when I got a better look. She had dark auburn hair that was cut in a page boy look. She had a button nose and a slender but cute figure. If she had pointed ears, I would have thought her an elf. And right now, she looked like an angry elf. Eventually, the girl came up and tossed a new coaster on the bar in front of me. "What would you like? Can I get something to eat?" I asked. She snorted and then sighed. "Yeah, I guess so. What do you want?" "Could I get a hamburger and some French fries? I'd also like a bottle of Coors if you have it. If not, I'll take any domestic beer." "The hamburger will take at least 20 minutes, she snapped. "They're just getting the grills going. Why don't you order a sandwich?" The bit about a sandwich was spat out more like a command than a question. I hadn't had a particularly good day, and her attitude irked me. I didn't have to be anywhere, so screw it. I wanted a hamburger. "I can wait." "I want a hamburger," I said with a smile. After she put my bottle of beer in front of me, none too gently, she turned in a huff. As she stormed away, I couldn't help but wonder who crapped in her crispy critters this morning. I continued to watch as she dropped my order off, headed to the back and up a set of stairs that I hadn't noticed when I came in. The other 2 guys had disappeared into the kitchen. I didn't know whether they had something to do in there, or if they were just trying to stay out of the way of the angry elf. Having performed in many bars, I was somewhat taken aback by her attitude. She seemed more than agitated. She seemed totally pissed off. I hadn't a clue as to what was bothering her, but I, for sure, wasn't going to put up with it if she gave me any more of her shit. I sipped my beer for a few minutes as I waited for my food and finally got bored. So, I got up and wandered around. I estimated that this place could easily hold a couple hundred people with the tables and chairs in place. Then I saw a sign that said the occupancy was limited to 275. Stopping in front of the stage, I estimated that it was a 20-foot by 20-foot raised platform. I saw a bass guitar, a banjo, a synthesizer, and a kazoo on the stage. The synthesizer wasn't a top-of-the-line model, but it still must have cost at least $1,800. It seemed strange that they didn't have an acoustic guitar. The reason for that, I would learn in just a couple of minutes. Damn it, Carl, Ty, just up and quit. I heard the voice of the girl with the auburn hair yell. I looked up and could see a short, heavy-set man descending the stairs with the girl hot on his heels. The man, whom I guessed was Carl, appeared to be in his 50s or 60s. He had thin white hair, a potbelly, and a bulbous nose. The elf-like woman looked like she was ready to explode. "That's not my problem, Tanya," Carl said with a matter-of-fact voice. "If you can't replace him in the next hour, I'll get another group. Besides, you guys aren't setting the world on fire. Still, even if you can't get a replacement, I'll let you guys stay and work the bar until the new group gets the hang of it." "Screw you," Tanya said and stormed off into the kitchen. Then I heard yelling, and all three of them came out arguing. The gist of the argument was about replacing Ty with somebody who played acoustic guitar. Since I can play any kind of guitar, I thought this might be a golden opportunity. "Excuse me," I interrupted their argument, "but I couldn't help but overhear that you need an acoustic guitarist." "What about it?" Tanya snapped. "I can play any kind of guitar," I said with a smile. Tanya just frowned at me and turned back to her companions. "We've got to find someone established, or we're out on our butts." The taller of the men looked at Tanya and then back to me. "Can you really play any guitar?" "Yeah," I responded enthusiastically. "What about songs? We're basically a cover group leaning more toward the 60s and 70s pop and country. Do you know any Beatles, Johnny Mathis, Dolly Parton, John Denver, Patsy Cline, or Glenn Campbell songs?" "Yeah, I know pretty much all of their songs," I kind of lied. I knew all of Beatles, John Denver, Dolly Parton, and Loretta Lynn's songs. I used many of them when I performed in Tifton. However, I was a little shaky when it came to Johnny Mathis, and I only knew one Glenn Campbell song, Rhinestone Cowboy. He wasn't one of my favorites. But when it came to Patsy Cline, I knew all of her big hits. Patsy Cline was my all-time favorite country singer. I usually ended my shows with one of her lesser-known hits, True Love. I don't know why, but singing that Patsy Cline song always seemed to get me a standing ovation. As to knowing the songs, I figured whatever I didn't know, I could learn quickly. "Simon, we're wasting time," Tanya complained. "We need to call a talent agency and see if they can get us someone for tonight. What's it going to take 5-10 minutes to find out if this guy can do what he says?" The guy argued and then turned to the other male. "What do you think, George?" "Yeah, why not?" George nodded. "And if you don't want to listen, Tanya, you can go see if an agency has someone for us." "Fine," Tanya stalked away, and I saw her pull her cell phone out and start searching the web. This was, hopefully, turning out to be a better day than I thought when I first walked into this bar. I headed for the stage, but George grabbed my arm. "Wait a second, my bass guitar and Simon's banjo aren't going to work. There's an old guitar that Ty left because he bought a new one. It isn't very good, but we'll take that into consideration." George disappeared and returned a few minutes later with the promised guitar. It was pretty old and beat up. It also had dust on it, indicating that it hadn't been played in a while. Still, beggars can't be choosers. I brushed the dust off and began tuning the guitar after taking a spot on the stage. Once I had Ty's old guitar tuned as much as it ever would be, I decided that I'd only sing parts of 4 or 5 songs to give them a flavor of what I could do. I just hoped I would be good enough. I wanted this gig badly. I hadn't been able to perform for weeks. Besides, I was beginning to burn through the $5,000. When I was ready, I looked out at Simon and George and smiled. "Hey, it's great to be here. I can't believe the size of this crowd. Settle back, and let's get this show cranking." The two men cracked up, with George giving me a thumbs up. I then began with part of the only Glenn Campbell song I knew, Rhinestone Cowboy. Then I segued to Willie Nelson's On the Road Again, then to Dolly Parton's 9 to 5, and finished with Patsy Cline's True Love. When I finished, the guys were clapping and whistling. Even the few people in the bar were clapping. It felt great, and I glanced over at Tanya. I knew that she would have the final say, and I said a silent prayer that she'd give me a chance. I stood by myself on the small stage, watching 3 people talk about me as though I wasn't there. I sort of felt like I was back in high school waiting to get a test back that I wasn't sure I'd passed. Only in this case, I had just finished a mini audition for a small cover band that played in a bar called Big Carl's. I had been in Atlanta for 2 weeks without finding a job, and my funds were dwindling. I didn't know what this particular job paid, but anything coming in would help stem my financial bleeding until I could find a real job. However, although beautiful, the group's leader, Tanya, impressed me as being a total bitch. As much as I wanted into this group, I figured she'd tell me to take a hike. As I stepped down off the stage, I watched her closely. She had put away her phone and was staring at me intently. I took the fact that she wasn't snarling as a good sign, but then she wasn't smiling either. Finally, Tanya had joined George and Simon. Both the guys were almost giddy with their smiles, but Tanya's face still revealed nothing. Finally, she smiled and stuck her hand out. "I'm Tanya Parker, and the tall one here is Simon Obacker, and the other is George Sanders. I put this group together, and we're known as Tanya and the Crew. And you are?" I took her hand and replied, "I'm Robbie Wilder." "Well, Robbie Wilder," Tanya said after releasing my hand, "do you have an acoustic guitar? Do bears shit in the woods?" I laughed. "Silly question," she smiled and then went serious. "Here's the deal. We get paid $900 for singing 3 hours on Friday and 3 hours on Saturday nights. We also work behind the bar for the rest of the week. We put a tip jar out while we're singing. I get $300, and you guys split the rest. Any tips we get are split 4 ways. Your hourly pay for working the bar, which isn't much, is yours, as are any tips you get while serving drinks. Is this something that would interest you?" Again, the thing about the bears, I was ecstatic. Tanya laughed and went back behind the bar. She returned 15 seconds later with several pages stapled together. It was a list of songs. The first 3 pages are the songs we do all the time. The other pages are songs that we drop in periodically. Check them out and let me know which ones you don't know. I scanned down the first page and a half and knew all of them. Then I found a Glenn Campbell song I wasn't familiar with and pointed to it. Tanya pulled out a copy of her own and marked that song. I finished off the complete list and found 5 more songs I didn't know. "That's pretty impressive," Simon said. "Ties was with us for a year, and there were 30 or 40 dozen songs that he either didn't bother to learn or couldn't play. How soon can you go get your guitar and get back here?" Tanya asked as she looked at her watch. "As long as it takes Marta to get me to College Park, pick up my guitar and hustle back here." "Good. I'd like to have a little warm-up practice before we go on." After they wrapped up my burger, I paid my bill and flew out the door. Luck was with me when I hit the MARTA station as a train had just come in. 20 minutes later, I hopped off and ran to the Monroe's house. I figured it was only a little before noon, so I had time to take a quick shower and change my clothes. I walked on air back to the station with my guitar. $200 a week wouldn't be enough to cover all my expenses. Still, with tips and whatever I'd get paid for working behind the bar, I figured it would carry me until I found a full-time job. When I reached the platform, I had to wait about 10 minutes for the next train. All the while I was standing there, I bounced up and down, willing the train to come. I was back at the bar about 1:15. Tanya, George, and Simon were already playing when I walked in. As quickly as I could, I got my guitar out and tuned it. Then I stepped up onto the stage and waited to be told what to do. I listened as the group played Glenn Campbell's Southern Nights with Simon and Tanya singing it as a duet. It sounded good. Tanya had a beautiful voice, and Simon had a decent bass quality to his. I didn't really know the song, but I quickly picked up the melody, and when they were about halfway through, I was able to join in. They all looked over and nodded. When the song ended, Tanya went to get some water bottles, and when she returned, she tossed me a blue t-shirt with Tanya and the Crew on the front. After handing out the water, Tanya started telling me what she expected. She decided which songs would be sung at each performance and in what order. I glanced at her list and didn't find anything I couldn't handle. Then she wanted me to sing Patsy Cline's True Love with her. It's always a little dicey singing a duet with someone you don't know. You're never quite sure what your singing partner is going to do. Sometimes they come in late or early. Some hold a note longer than they should. Some sing at a faster or slower tempo than the song is supposed to be sung. I found Tanya very easy to sing with. We matched and harmonized perfectly. Moments after we got into the song, I noticed that the other employees and the few customers had turned to watch us. When we finished, even though the numbers were small, we got a rousing ovation. "We're absolutely doing that song tonight," Tanya said as she thumbed through her sheets. We did the beginnings of about a dozen songs, and Tanya called an end to the practice. Then George told me to follow him into the kitchen. where he gave me a bartender's apron. I have to be honest, I admitted with trepidation. I can play the guitar and sing, but I don't know anything about bartending. He laughed. It isn't rocket science. Tonight, we'll just have you serving the beer in bottles and her draft. If there's time, I'll show you how to mix a few simple drinks. You'll pick it up pretty quickly. Just remember to be quick and smile. That will get you more tips. At 5, more and more people began to drift into the bar, and I was hopping back and forth, serving bottles of beer or pouring drafts. That night, I must have moved 30 cases of beer from the cooler out to the bar. I also learned how to install a new keg, slice dozens of all kinds of fruit, and learn how to mix a half dozen drinks. I was pretty frazzled when 8 o'clock approached and we headed to the stage. However, when I looked around, Tanya wasn't anywhere in sight. I just shrugged and retuned my guitar. About 5 minutes later, Tanya appeared to a round of applause. If my eyes weren't attached, they would have dropped to the floor. Tanya wasn't wearing a blue t-shirt. She had changed into a blue and green sundress which was cut fairly low in the front. A good portion of her breasts was exposed, and the mystery of what remained, I'm sure, left many of the men in the audience drooling. As I looked out, only about half of the bar was full, but the patrons that were there were already pretty well lubricated. I had learned that this could be good or bad. A crowd that was very relaxed with alcohol was easier to entertain. They also tended to buy more drinks. However, there is a fine line between a relaxed customer and an obnoxious drunk. Still, I was super excited to get the night going. Tanya kicked off the night singing Dolly Parton's 9 to 5, which got the crowd into it right away. Then we moved to a Johnny Cash song, followed by a Willie Nelson's On the Road Again, with all of us joining in. After about an hour and a half, Tanya told the crowd that we were taking a 15-minute break, and we'd be back. Sitting in the kitchen sucking down a bottle of water, I felt more at peace than at any time since my divorce. For the first time, I didn't feel the dagger of pain in my heart. I hoped they wouldn't kick me out of the group after tonight. The crowd had been great so far, and Tanya was certainly the focus of all the males in the bar. She also had the attention of a goodly number of women. But as soon as we started the second half of our show, I knew something was off. There was a table of 2 women and 3 men close to the stage, and I knew instantly that they weren't feeling any pain. They were also getting kind of boisterous and rude. They had crossed the line from relaxed to obnoxious. Tanya was into her second song when one of the men made a crude remark about Tanya's hips. His comment wasn't wrong. Tanya had a spectacular hips, but the comment was totally out of line. And I could see that Tanya was getting angry, so I decided to step in. I had handled drunks many times before. Drunks, as a general rule, aren't bad people. They've just lost their inhibitions. The best way to deal with them was with humor and a little embarrassment. So, when Tanya finished her song, I grabbed the mic from her. Thank you, I said as the light applause began to die out. Tanya looked at me with annoyance, but didn't say anything. We absolutely love it when people in the audience enjoy our shows. And this table over here seems to be enjoying the show more than anyone else. We like to show our appreciation for what you might call our super fans. I then turned to the audience. Would you like to meet one of our super fans tonight? The crowd started clapping and calling out, yes, yes, yes. I smiled and, of course, singled out the loudmouth. I pointed to the rowdy gentleman and said, you, sir, seem to be having the best time of anyone. Stand up and let everyone see you. The drunk jumped to his feet, swayed a little, and said, screw you. I'm sorry, I don't swing that way, I said with a smile. Not that there's anything wrong if that's your preference. The crowd roared with laughter and started to whistle. What's your name, sir? I quickly asked. Frank, he roared back. And I still say screw you. I don't know how much dating you do, Frank, but that approach isn't going to win any woman's heart. Again, the crowd howled and laughed. Now, Frank, I said innocently, I can call you Frank, can I? Hell yeah. Boy, you have a one-track mind, I said, laughing with the crowd. Now, Frank, you seem to have a strong opinion about one particular part of my friend's anatomy. I think it is only fair that your same anatomy should be judged. What do you think, folks? On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate Frank's butt? A roar of laughter was followed by numbers being called out. 4, 2, -10. I let the number calling go on for about 10 seconds before I announced. It seems that you have fallen very short in that part of your anatomy. I hope there is nothing else that would fall short on your body. Then I looked to the ladies sitting at the table who had been laughing as hard as anyone else. Ladies, you know Frank. Does he have any other deficiencies? The 2 women were nodding and cracking up. Then one of the women held up her thumb and forefinger about an inch apart. This brought the house down. Frank turned scarlet and stormed from the room, jarring 2 tables as he went. When he was finally out of the front door, the room got very quiet. I looked around and spread my hands in mock confusion. Was it something I said? The room went wild, and I got a standing ovation. As I handed the mic back to Tanya, she reached over and kissed me on the cheek. She said into the mic, "My hero." This brought another roar from the crowd. The rest of the show went off very well, especially when Tanya and I sang Patsy Cline's True Love at the end. We got a standing ovation. I was nervous as we started off the stage. I know the show had gone well, but I didn't know what to expect at this point. I had overstepped my bounds by taking the mic, but it just seemed to be the thing to do at the time. George was the first to speak. "That was our best show ever." Simon followed immediately. "Robbie, you had them eating out of your hand. Outstanding job." I turned to Tanya because I knew she seemed to have the final say. She just walked up to me and gave me a big hug. I guess I was in. We weren't expected to tend bar after our performance, but we wound up helping the regulars and helped with the cleanup. During this time, I learned that Simon was gay and lived with his boyfriend, Dave. I was relieved that he wasn't offended by my comments directed at the drunk. In fact, he thought it was really funny to watch the guy squirm. George was single and a real womanizer. He had a girl waiting for him to finish. If George hadn't made her show us her driver's license, I would have sworn she was no older than 15. I was shocked to learn she was 23. Lucky George. Tanya was very closed. All I got from her was that she had attended Juilliard in New York for a year. Tanya didn't say anything about why she decided to leave school. All she said about her family was that her father had deserted them, and her mother was dead. I also learned that Tanya was single and rarely dated. I didn't care. I was just thrilled to be able to perform and get paid for it. We had another show the following night, and to me, it seemed like the crowd was slightly bigger, but I couldn't be sure. However, after my first show, Carl had taken me aside and told me that he was impressed with how I handled the drunk. I thought we had another great show the second night, and Tanya and I sang 3 songs together. However, Carl pulled me aside again after that show and gave me some advice, or maybe it was a warning. "Kid, you got talent," he said, patting me on my shoulder. "But in this business, don't trust anyone. Not Simon, or George, or Tanya, and for sure, don't trust me." As the weeks went by, I felt we were beginning to click on stage. But off stage, while George and Simon were very friendly, Tanya was a very cold and distant ice princess. That didn't bother me at all as long as I could perform. To me, playing my guitar and singing fed my soul, and getting paid was just a huge bonus. The routine for the next 6 weeks was the same, working the bar and playing music each weekend while I continued to look for a job during the week. However, I have to admit that I wasn't looking too hard. I was covering my expenses with the money from performing, tips, and minuscule pay for working the bar. And with each passing week, Susie was becoming a distant memory, and the pain was fading. By my estimation, the crowds were getting bigger, but again, I had no way to measure it. Even if it was true, Carl decided to make a change, and on that Monday, he told us that the upcoming weekend would be our last. He was bringing in a Beatles cover band for a 6-week deal. I was devastated. That meant I'd have to once again start looking for a job in earnest. Carl had proved his advice to be spot on. I thought he liked our act and appreciated it, but the truth was, he didn't give a shit about us. Anyway, once Carl lowered the boom on us, I went out and bought a newspaper. I was scanning the want ads when Tanya stuck her head over my shoulder. "What are you doing?" she asked with a smile. "As much as I regret my decision not to do it," I said, grinning back. "I never trained myself to only eat once a week. I have to get a job. In fact, all of us need to find gainful employment." "Already taken care of," Tanya said as she grinned and walked away. "What?" I said, spinning on my stool. "Did you find a job already?" "No," she said with a coy smile. "We all found a job." "No way. Where? What kind of job?" I responded in total confusion. "George. Simon." Tanya yelled into the kitchen. "Come out here. We have to talk about something." Once Tanya had us all together, she led us to a table on the far side of the bar. George and Simon were as confused as I was, but they didn't say anything until everyone was seated. "Okay, Tanya," George finally asked, "what do we need to discuss?" "I've got our next bookings lined up," Tanya said calmly. "Really?" George and Simon said at the same time. "Yup, at the Abbey Tree Lounge in Alpharetta for 4 weeks, and then at the Uptown Club in Cummings for 5 weeks. Then we're going to Charlotte, North Carolina. Brad Brooks and Honey Weston are doing 2 shows at the Spectrum Center. Their opening act canceled on them, so we're filling in." "What's the pay?" Simon asked. "At the Abbey, we're getting $2,000 a week. But we have to perform 6 nights and 2 matinees, one on Saturday and one on Sunday. They also want us to tin bar like we do here. At the Uptown, they're going to pay us $2,200 with the same deal as the Abbey. For the 2 concerts in Charlotte, we're getting $4,000 for the 2 nights. The Spectrum is a big venue, Simon said in awe. That place holds at least 20,000 people. How did you arrange all of this since Saturday? I couldn't help but ask. Tanya responded with a Cheshire Cat look. Actually, I've been working on it for a couple of months. An agent caught our show and liked it. He contacted me when the Spectrum job came available. But I figure if we do well in Charlotte, we could be on our way. We all looked at each other with huge smiles. Then Tanya chuckled. I was going to tell Carl on Sunday, but he beat me to the punch. I didn't say anything to him because I figured if he thought we were down and out, he might slip us a little something else. Carl? George snickered. He'd steal his grandmother's eye teeth if he thought he could make a buck off of them. Before we get all excited, Simon said as he put his hands up, how are we going to get to Alpharetta and Cummings? Marta doesn't go there. And even if we get to Charlotte, where are we going to stay? Rooms for 2 nights could eat up a big chunk of what we earn. Tanya looked at me questioningly. Robbie, you said you had a car. What do you say? I shrugged my shoulders. Actually, it's an SUV, but yeah, I can drive us if you guys will chip in some money for gas. But Simon's right about Charlotte. If it was just me, I'd sleep in my car, but with the 4 of us, that wouldn't work. That's already taken care of, Tanya said quickly. They've arranged a room for us for 1 night. I figured we'd travel up the day of the show, perform, and spend the night. After the 2nd show, we'll head back. The only downside is that it's only 1 room. And just so it's clear with you 3, I get one of the beds. If it just has a king or queen size, you all are sleeping on the floor. If there are twin beds, you guys can fight over the other one. Both the Alpharetta and the Cummings engagements went well. The customers at both establishments were generous, and we made almost $1,000 each week in tips. In Cummings, after we sang True Love at the end of the show, this guy came up and said he'd pay us $100 if we do it again. So we did. The Spectrum was mind-blowing. None of us had ever performed before an audience that large. It was a little unnerving for George and Simon, but Tanya wasn't intimidated at all. As for me, if you can survive farting in front of thousands of people, very little phases you after that. Fortunately, we all pulled it together. And by the end of our set both nights, we had the crowd out of their seats, ready for the night's main entertainment. As we took our final bows the 2nd night, I looked over at Tanya. Her eyes were shining. It seemed to me that Tanya was chasing the dream. After the Spectrum appearance, we all thought we were really on the move up. However, the opposite happened. Things really tapered off. We'd work a week or 2, and then nothing for 2 or 3 weeks. It got downright grim, and I was tempted to go look for a regular job. But I didn't want to give up performing, and I didn't want to leave Tanya in the lurch. Right after the new year, George and Simon told Tanya that they couldn't do it anymore. Simon took a job as a waiter, and George took a job as a carpenter on a construction site. All that time, I worked with George and never knew he was a carpenter. Tanya was about as down as one person could be. I have to admit that I wasn't feeling like any ray of sunshine either. I was a little better off than Tanya because I still had some of my bankroll I'd brought from Tifton. Even with that, my funds were beginning to dwindle at an alarming rate. I was about to throw in the towel when Tanya called me one morning and told me to meet her at the Pancake House. She, apparently, had an idea to jumpstart our musical careers. I knew I should be looking for a job, but I just couldn't say no to Tanya. I guess I was a little in love with her, even at that point. But I never said or did anything to let on. I didn't want to get burned again, and I didn't want to sour our musical relationship. The next day, I found Tanya sitting at a table sipping a cup of coffee. I slid into the chair next to her and asked, "So, what's your new idea?" "He should be here in a few minutes," she responded, and then nodded to the front of the restaurant. There he is now. Glancing toward the entrance, I saw a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard looking around. When he saw Tanya, he waved and headed in our direction. He seemed to be in his early 50s with a friendly smile. He wore a dark blue sports coat, gray slacks, and a white-collared shirt. "Robbie, this is Alex Meisner," Tanya introduced us. "He's a musical agent. He caught our act and thinks he can help us." With very little small talk, Mr. Meisner began discussing what we faced. The music industry has changed dramatically with the advent of the internet. For the most part, people download the music they want. Gone are the days of cutting a record and trying to convince a radio station to play it. Anyone can download their music to the internet, so you have to create your own exposure, your own excitement, your own brand. "That sounds great," I said. "But how do we accomplish that?" "That's what I do for you," Alex said confidently. The first thing we need to do is get you playing at as many different places as possible. That's the problem, Tanya admitted. We started to get some bookings and even appeared at the Spectrum in Charlotte, but then everything seemed to dry up after that. I heard about your performance at the Spectrum, and that probably hurt you. How could that be? Tanya demanded. Well, from what I hear, you guys did pretty well, Alex explained. As a result, a lot of the people booking acts figured you'd want too much money, so they crossed you guys off their list. So, you're saying we were penalized for being good? I asked in disbelief. Alex nodded. I guess that's a fair assessment. So, what do we do now? I asked, churning inside at the unfairness of the system. Again, that's where I come in, the agent said as he stirred his coffee. I can get you booked in a bunch of different places, but they'll only be for a night or two, and then you'll be on to a new location. Mr. Meisner then looked over at me. Tanya tells me that you write songs. Yeah, I do, I admitted. But so does she. I've got 3 shoeboxes full of them, but we've never used any of them in our shows. Do you have any that revolve around kids? It can be babies, toddlers, teenagers, anything to do with children. I'm sure I have some, I admitted, but some of the songs aren't that good. I have a couple also, Tanya chimed in, but my songs are pretty rough also. Doesn't matter. Try to polish up your songs as well as you can. We're going to record the best ones you have. Then I want both of you to go through and pick out the best 6 to 8 songs with the same theme made famous by other artists. I looked over at Tanya, and she appeared to be as befuddled as I was. Okay, we can do that, but what's the point? I have a friend who works for a magazine that caters to child-rearing. He's always looking for new ideas to write about. I pitched him with the idea of a singing group putting together an album about kids, and he liked it. Now, if he likes the music, he'll do the article about you too. Alex Meisner really knew his business, and I was getting excited. But the big question I had was, what does this guy want in return? It was Tanya who posed the question. It all sounds good, Alex, she said in her no-nonsense voice. What do you get out of all this? I assume you're not working for free. He chuckled. Tanya, no one in this business works for free. If you want my help, you'll have to sign a standard contract that makes me your exclusive agent. You can take it to any attorney you want, but you'll find it is pretty similar to most contracts out there. Let me hit you with some of the important highlights. First of all, I get 10% of what you earn. That's non-negotiable. But I don't get a penny unless I get you paying gigs. Second, the contract is for 5 years with an option for 5 additional years. Also, I get the final say about the outfits you wear, the music you play, and the group's name. Sorry, but Tanya and the crew doesn't cut it. Your new name will be the Wind Dreamers. Tanya didn't like that at all and argued to keep the original name. Alex was adamant about the change, and in the end, Tanya acquiesced. Then Tanya spent 20 minutes reading through the contract. She could have been a damn good lawyer with her smarts and attention to detail. When Tanya finished reviewing the contract, she had no objections but did pick up 2 spelling mistakes. We then both signed it. The next 6 months were like a blur. I found 6 songs in my box that weren't horrible. Alex especially liked 2 I had written, A Small Child's Love and Daddy's Little Helper. Tanya had 2 songs he liked as well, Pretty Little Girl and Mommy's Angel. The other 2 were mine, definitely weren't memorable. I didn't care too much for my outfit. It had me in tight leather pants, a fluffy long-sleeved white shirt with a leather vest. Tanya's outfit, on the other hand, was hot. She wore a short leather skirt and a blouse that was really cut low. One other change that Alex made was the addition of a synthesizer in our act. With George and Simon gone, he wanted more than just my acoustic guitar. Alex hired several different guys to man the synthesizer. However, a young guy named John Tynan was the one who performed with us the most. We were playing every night and even a bunch of matinees. We played in every venue you could think of, from bars to college auditoriums to churches. The churches were fun for me because of my familiarity with gospel music. Tanya hated doing those performances because the men would leer at her and the women would stare daggers. And this was with a blouse that was cut much higher. I was on the go so much that Mrs. Monroe stopped me one morning as I was on my way in to collapse into bed. "Robbie, I worry about you," she said with kind eyes, radiating sympathy. "You're on the go all hours of the day and night. I don't think you're getting enough to eat, and I know you aren't getting enough sleep." "Thanks for worrying about me, Mom," I teased her as I gave her a kiss on the cheek. "I'm doing good, though." She swatted my arm. "Go get some sleep, and I'll fix you something to eat when you get up." The article for the childcare magazine was a big hit, and Alex sent us into a studio to produce an album. That used up most of my reserve. Anyway, it was released to the internet the same day the article was published. We had incorporated the 4 songs that I already mentioned with 8 songs made famous by others. The way it was set up, people could buy our album or individual songs online. Our internet sales were just short of terrible. However, we did pretty well selling our CDs at each of our performances. We could buy the CDs for $5 each, sell them for $12, and sell between $25 and $50 a night. That was like $175 to $350 extra each night. All during this time, Tanya and I were getting closer. We had even started dating. I felt that Tanya was way out of my league, but I loved her anyway. Still, Tanya kept telling me that I was the only one she truly trusted and loved. I had been the only one who stood by her when things were at rock bottom. I remember the first time we made love. We had been necking off and on for weeks, but Tanya didn't want to take it any further, and I wasn't about to push for anything she didn't want. But then, one night, we were just sitting there, and she leaned over and whispered in my ear, "I want you." That's all it took, and we were all over each other. Tanya couldn't get her clothes off quickly enough and ripped at my clothes because I wasn't fast enough either. Once on the bed, I knew Tanya wanted me inside her immediately. Sex was great. After that night, there was no going back. I was hopelessly in love with and committed to Tanya. 2 months later, I asked her to marry me, and she said yes. It was Alex who floated the idea of filming our wedding and releasing it on DVD. I was very hesitant about doing that, but Tanya was all for it. She thought it would give our careers a big boost. Finally, I agreed, and it was decided that we do it during a performance we had scheduled for one of the larger churches in the Atlanta area. I don't know how Alex convinced the church people to go along with his idea, but they did. Still, I hoped that it would be a relatively quiet wedding mixed with music and love. I got 2 out of the 3. The wedding, from my perspective, was filled with glorious music and tons of love. Quiet, however, the wedding was not. The local media had gotten wind of it, and being a slow news cycle, they descended on the church in hordes. I didn't want to let the media inside, but Tanya and the church board overruled me. Still, the church board had laid down very strict guidelines that kept the media from being their usual boorish, arrogant selves. Tanya and I discussed our wedding vows in some detail. Finally, we decided to sing a song made famous by Peter, Paul, and Mary, "This Is Love." It was Tanya who first suggested the song. I loved the idea but was surprised that Tanya would pick it. The song has a very deep religious tone, and I knew that Tanya wasn't religious at all. However, the song is tailor-made for a wedding. It is probably used in tens of thousands of marriages each year. I especially felt that the final line said everything about our love. For whenever 2 or more of you are gathered in his name, there is love, there is love. We sang the song before the actual wedding ceremony, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church. I noticed that even some of the media people were misty-eyed. After reciting our vows, Tanya and I sang a song I had written for the occasion, "You Are My One and Only True Love." When our voices began to fade away, the congregation and our friends were on their feet with a roar. It took almost 5 minutes for them to quiet down. Then we began the performance we had been contracted for. We had tailored our song list to include more love songs with some of the more uplifting hymns. One part of the performance was very special. I had invited the Monroes to the wedding and even had them sitting in the same row as my parents. Mrs. Monroe loved Nat King Cole and especially his song "When I Fall in Love." I had arranged to do my version of the song for Mrs. Monroe. Thank God for the synthesizer because Nat had a full orchestra behind him when he recorded his version. Before I began, I let everyone know that this song was for my second mother. I must not have done too badly because I could see tears running down Mrs. Monroe's cheeks as she snuggled close to her husband. Even Mr. Monroe's eyes were misting. Yes, my mother was also crying. My father tried to pretend that he had something in his eye. He did. It was tears. During the reception, I cornered Mr. and Mrs. Monroe with their sons. I told them I had left presents for all of them in the garage. For Tabor and Tyran, I had gotten them the latest Apple phones. Years later, when I learned about Tabor's death, they told me he was clutching that phone as he died. For Henry, I had gotten him the best table saw I could find. He was always doing odd jobs around the house. Henry had told me that he would get a table saw when he could afford it, and then he'd really be able to fix up the house. For Mabel, I got her an expensive Bose CD player and the complete CD collection of Nat King Cole. She had about worn out her record collection, playing them over and over again. After the reception, Tanya and I left on our honeymoon to Key West, Florida. It was the happiest week of my life up until then: sun, surf, and Tanya. During the honeymoon, we had chosen a location that had no television or internet access. As a result, we had no idea that our wedding DVD was selling like hotcakes. The 2 songs, There Is Love and You Are My One and Only True Love were released as singles and were climbing the charts. There Is Love would make it to number 32 on the Billboard Hot 100, and You Are My One and Only True Love made it to number 19 on the Country Top 100. Now we were starting to make some money and never seemed to lack bookings. We were even invited to perform at the Grand Ole Opry. With this surge, Alex felt that Tanya should become the face of our group. I totally agreed. She was a lot more fun to look at than I was. So, I willingly let Alex do his thing. For the next 4.5 years, we did well. Still, Tanya was not content. She felt that we should be doing a lot better. I always put musical talent into 3 categories. There were the A-list people and groups that included the cream of the crop. I'm talking about people like Tim McGraw and Carrie Underwood, or groups like the Statler Brothers or the Charlie Daniels Band. They were the stars that everyone knew and had most of the big hits. Then there was the B-list with people or groups like Tanya and me, who had a few hits but weren't big stars. And finally, there was everyone else. The vast majority of entertainers never were able to support themselves singing. Tanya and I had done amazingly well. I considered us in the lower half of the B group. Still, we were doing fairly well. We frequently opened for some of the A-list acts. The fact that we had 2 minor hits was more than 99% of all performers ever achieve. We were making a mid-5-figure income each year. We weren't superstars, but we were known. We had our own fan base and had played at the Grand Ole Opry. Still, despite our good fortune, which was mostly due to Alex's planning and promotions, Tanya wanted to reach the very top. I love Tanya's passion, but I knew we weren't good enough to crack the A-list. Even more worrisome to me was that Tanya had totally fallen into the trap my grandfather had warned me about years ago. I wondered how she would handle it when Tanya finally realized that she would never be a superstar. Still, I trusted her and Alex to keep us moving forward, or I should say moving upward. Everything changed, however, while I was away visiting my parents in Tifton. Tanya and I had planned to go together, but she had a cold and didn't want me to pass it on. So, I went by myself. I had planned to spend a week with my parents. That's when things changed, and the snake was allowed to slither into our garden. I met my wife when I joined her musical group, Tanya and the Crew. Back then, we were a cover group that sang mostly country and pop songs made famous by other people. Our music careers were on the verge of crashing and burning when a musical agent, Alex Meisner, agreed to manage us. Slowly, he began to build up our act. After Tanya and I were married, we had established a decent reputation. We weren't superstars by any means, but we were making a damn good living. Married life with Tanya, for me anyway, was great. She seemed to be happy, and our love life was good. Still, I knew that Tanya wasn't satisfied with our careers. She was always after Alex to get us better everything. Tanya wanted better venues, better studio musicians, better recording contracts, more television exposure. In short, Tanya was chasing the dream of being a superstar and was frustrated that we weren't making more progress. And I had to admit that this worried me because, occasionally, Tanya would take her frustrations out on me. This always hurt because I was working harder than anyone to make her dream come true.